The plumber sent me a photo at 11:42 in the morning, and I remember the exact time because I had just poured my second cup of coffee and was thinking about whether to call my daughter back or wait until after lunch. The photo showed a wall, not a pipe, not a leak, not anything that had to do with why I'd called him in the first place. Just a wall, the back of the utility room in the basement, behind the water softener I'd been meaning to replace for 2 years. And underneath the photo, one line of text: Mr. Aldridge, is this supposed to be here? Looks like a door. I set my coffee down. I've lived in this house for 19 years. I raised my kids here. I shoveled that driveway every winter, fixed the back fence twice, repainted the kitchen when my wife said the beige was making her tired. I knew every corner of that basement. I stored fishing gear down there, my tax files going back 2009, 2 boxes of Christmas decorations we never use anymore. I typed back. What do you mean a door? He called instead of texting. His name was the plumber. I keep thinking of him that way, just the plumber, because even now I can't quite fit his name into the story of what happened that day. He said, and I'll remember this exactly, "Sir, there's a frame built into the drywall back here. Somebody put it in deliberate. There's a latch on it. It's not original to the house." I told him not to touch it. I was in the car 7 minutes later. My name is Robert Aldridge. I'm 63 years old. I live in Guelph, Ontario, in a 2-story house on a quiet street where the neighbors still wave when you pull into the driveway. I worked in municipal planning for 31 years. I coached minor hockey for 9 seasons. I thought I knew what my life looked like. My wife Sylvia had left 4 days earlier to stay with her sister in Kelowna. Her sister had just had knee surgery and needed help for a couple weeks. At least that's what I was told. We'd been married for 34 years. We had 2 kids, our son Joel, who lives in Mississauga with his wife and their daughter, and our daughter Pam, who's 31 and works in insurance in Hamilton. Sylvia and I weren't in a great place. We both knew it. We'd been saying things like, we just need a bit of time, and this is just a phase in retirement, and all the other phrases that let you avoid saying the actual thing. But we weren't fighting. We weren't cruel to each other. I still made sure she had the car with the better heat, and she still left a casserole in the fridge before she went away. That was us. We were the kind of couple who managed things quietly. I had called the plumber because one of the basement pipes had been making a knocking sound for 3 weeks, and I wanted it looked at before winter. That's all. That was the only reason anyone was in my basement on a Tuesday morning in October. When I got there, he was standing at the back of the utility room with his arms crossed, looking at the wall like it had said something to offend him. He was a young guy, maybe 30, with a measure tape clipped to his belt and the kind of calm that tradespeople get when they've seen enough strange things they've stopped being surprised. He pointed. Between the water softener and the shelving unit where I keep my spare paint cans, the drywall did not sit flush. I don't know how I hadn't noticed it before. Looking at it now, it was obvious. The seam, the hinges painted over to match, the small recessed latch at about waist height. Someone had built it to look like a wall, and they'd done a decent job, but up close you could see the care that had gone into hiding it. I asked him to wait upstairs. I stood alone in the utility room for what felt like a long time. Then I reached out and pressed the latch. The door swung inward. It was a room, small, maybe 8 by 10 feet, dug back into the space behind the utility room that I'd assumed was just dead space against the foundation. There was a pull-string light on the ceiling, working, I discovered. A folding cot against the far wall, neatly made. A plastic bin with a lid. A small electric heater. And on the shelf built into the left wall, a series of objects that I could not immediately understand. A prepaid cell phone, 2 passports in a Ziploc bag, an envelope, and a set of keys on a ring with no label. I didn't touch anything. I took photographs with my phone. Then I sat down on the cold concrete floor of the utility room, with the door to that room open in front of me, and I tried to think. The room was clean, not dusty, not abandoned. The cot had a pillow with a fresh pillowcase. The heater looked like it had been used recently. This room wasn't old, someone had been maintaining it, and the only person who had access to this house, other than me, was Sylvia. I should tell you what I did and what I didn't do. I didn't call Sylvia. I didn't call the police. Not yet. I sat on the floor of my basement for about 20 minutes, and then I went upstairs and paid the plumber for his time, told him there was a misunderstanding with the previous contractor, and the room was for storage. He didn't ask questions. I think he didn't want to know. Then I went back downstairs. The passports. I opened the Ziploc bag with a dish towel so I wasn't leaving prints, not really knowing why, just some instinct to be careful. One passport was Canadian, issued 3 years ago. The name on it was Sylvia Aldridge, her real name, her real photo. The other was Canadian as well, issued 18 months ago. The name was Susan Marlowe. The photo was also Sylvia. I sat with that for a moment, Susan Marlowe. I set both passports down. I opened the envelope. Inside was a printout, account statements from a financial institution I didn't recognize. The account was in the name Susan Marlowe. The balance, as of a statement dated 2 months prior, was $81,420. Underneath the statements was a handwritten page. I recognized Sylvia's handwriting. It was a list. Flight YZMCO, rental confirmation, unit deposit, forwarding instructions. At the bottom, a date. Not a date far away. A date 6 weeks from now. I folded the page and put it back. I closed the envelope. I stood up. My legs were not entirely steady. I went upstairs, sat at the kitchen table, and I thought about the last 3 years, about the slow withdrawal, about how Sylvia had started keeping her own schedule, her own accounts. Just for my own organization, she'd said, and I hadn't questioned it because we'd always been reasonably independent. About the new friends I'd never quite met, and the book club that met on alternating Thursdays and never seemed to have any books. About the renovation estimate she'd arranged for the basement 2 summers ago, the one she said fell through. It hadn't fallen through. It had been completed. I called my son Joel that evening, not to tell him everything, just to hear his voice and to ask, casually, whether his mother had ever mentioned anything about a trip she was planning. He said no. He asked if everything was okay. I said yes. He said his mother had texted him just the day before asking about Thanksgiving, whether we were doing it at our place or his, and he'd assumed things were fine. I said of course. After I hung up, I sat with it a while longer. I'm not an impulsive person. 31 years in planning teaches you to think before you move, to collect information before you act, to know the full picture before you walk into the room. So I made a decision that night. I was not going to call Sylvia. I was not going to reveal what I'd found. I was going to wait and watch and understand what I was actually dealing with before I did anything. The next morning I called a lawyer, a woman I'd dealt with in a professional capacity years ago, now in private practice. I didn't tell her about the room. I asked her, as a general inquiry, about the division of assets in Ontario after a long marriage. She told me, 50-50 generally, unless there were exemptions. She asked if I was thinking about this for a reason. I said I was just thinking ahead, that I was 63 and it was sensible to understand these things. Then I called my bank. I had believed, for our entire married life, that we kept our finances reasonably organized together. Joint account for household expenses, separate accounts for personal spending, both of us listed on the mortgage that had been paid off 7 years ago. What I discovered working through the paperwork over the next 2 days was that Sylvia had been moving money. Small transfers, $50 here, $200 there, occasional larger amounts when she had reason to, home maintenance expenses she handled, a trip she booked and said was less than it was. Over years. Quietly, in the margins. It totaled, as best I could trace it, somewhere between $60,000 and $70,000. The $81,000 in the Susan Marlowe account was not all our money. But some of it was. Sylvia called on a Wednesday, 5 days after she'd left. She sounded relaxed. Her sister was doing better. She thought she might stay another week. She asked how the plumber went, and I said fine, just a loose fitting, nothing serious. She said, oh good. Her voice was exactly the voice I had known for 34 years. I had sat across from that voice at our kitchen table and argued about where to send the kids to school, and celebrated anniversaries and eaten 10,000 meals. And it sounded, at that moment, like everything was completely ordinary. I said, take all the time you need. After I hung up, I went back downstairs. I wasn't looking for more. I just stood in the doorway of that room and looked at what was in it. The cot, the heater, the shelf. And I thought about the kind of planning it takes to build something like this. Not just the physical room, that was one thing, but the account, the identity, the timeline, the years of patience. She had been planning to disappear, not to leave me, not to ask for a divorce, not to have a conversation and divide things and move on. She had planned to vanish and to leave me standing in a house with no explanation, holding the emptiness. And if the plumber had not been standing behind my water softener that Tuesday morning, she might have done it. I need to tell you about my daughter Pam. I called her 3 days after I found the room. I told her everything, including the passports, the account, the handwritten list. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Dad, how long?" I said I didn't know. At least 2 years based on the account history. Maybe longer based on when the room was built. She said the renovation estimate. I said yes, 3 summers ago. She said, "I remember Mom talking about that." She said it fell through because the contractor was booked too far ahead. A pause. She seemed relieved when it fell through. I said she wasn't relieved. She was finished. Pam said, "What are you going to do?" I told her I was going to understand it fully before I did anything. I told her not to say anything to her brother yet, and not to say anything to her mother. I hated asking her to carry that. She's a good person, my daughter, and she doesn't keep things well when they're heavy. But she said she would. She asked if I was okay. I said I didn't know yet. Over the following week, I gathered what I needed. I went through the filing cabinet in the office. My office, technically, though we both used it, and I found records I hadn't looked at in years. Insurance policies, property documents, a copy of our wills, last updated 12 years ago. The wills were interesting. Sylvia had updated hers, not our joint one. She had a separate individual will prepared. I found the paperwork for it tucked inside a folder labeled Dental Records 2019. It was dated 14 months ago. It referenced no joint property. It listed a beneficiary I didn't recognize, an organization called the Marlowe Family Trust. I wrote down the name. I also went through the cedar chest in our bedroom. We'd had it since we were married. It was her grandmother's, and she always said she kept sentimental things in it. Winter scarves, old birthday cards, a blanket her mother had knitted. I'd never looked through it, not once in 34 years, because it wasn't mine to look through. At the bottom, under the blanket, there was a box. Inside, a second, prepaid phone charged, with a contact list that had 2 numbers in it. One was labeled R. One was labeled A. I didn't call either number. I photographed the contacts. Then I put the phone back, exactly where I'd found it. The next step was a decision I made slowly, the way I make most decisions. I called the lawyer back and told her more. Not everything, enough. She said if what I was describing was accurate, there were legal mechanisms available to me, and I should move carefully and document everything, which I had been doing. She also said something I've thought about since. The hardest part of this kind of situation is not the legal side. It's that you're gathering evidence against someone you've been sharing a bed with for decades, and the two things don't fit together in your mind. Give yourself time to let them fit. I appreciated that. I gave myself the rest of the week. Then I set something in motion. I reached out to a man I'd known in my planning career, a quiet, thorough man who'd moved into private investigation after his own retirement, who I'll call just the investigator, because that's what he was to me in this story. I told him what I had. He asked a few questions. He said it was enough to work with. 3 weeks later, I knew who R was. Her name was Roberta Finch. She had been Sylvia's friend. I say had been, because she was apparently not the kind of friend I'd ever been introduced to. They had met, according to what the investigator pieced together, through a financial literacy group that met at the community center in Guelph about 4 years ago. Roberta was divorced, living alone, and by all appearances was the person who had introduced Sylvia to the idea of the second identity. She was the one who'd helped set up the Marlowe account. She had a sister in Orlando, and the unit deposit on Sylvia's handwritten list corresponded to a condominium purchase in the Orlando area, listed under the name Susan Marlowe, finalized 8 months ago. Florida. All of it was pointing to Florida. I knew who A was too, eventually, but that comes later. The date on Sylvia's handwritten list was 6 weeks from when I found it, which meant, by the time I had the full picture, I had approximately 2 weeks left. I want to be honest about what I felt during those weeks. It wasn't what people might expect. There's a version of this story where I was devastated, sleepless, unable to function. But I'm 63 years old and I've had losses before, and I think what I felt was something colder and more focused than grief. Grief is for things that are over. What I was dealing with was something that hadn't finished yet, and I couldn't let it finish the way it was supposed to. So I felt alert. I felt very, very clear. Joel and his wife were coming for the weekend, a visit that had been planned for a month. I made dinner Friday night. I listened to my son talk about work, and watched him play with his daughter on the living room floor, and thought about the fact that the life I was sitting in the middle of had been scheduled for demolition. Saturday morning, after Joel and his family left for the day, I went back to the basement. I had made a decision about the room. I was going to use it. Not the way it had been intended, but I was going to use it. I set up a small audio recorder, the kind I used to carry for site notes, voice activated, long battery life, and I placed it on the shelf, behind the prepaid phone, close enough to the door that it would capture the room and part of the utility area. Then I replaced everything exactly as I'd found it, closed the door, and went upstairs. I waited for Sylvia to come home. She came back on a Sunday, 11 days after she'd left. She looked rested. She brought a bottle of Okanagan wine and a jar of peach preserves from a farm stand her sister liked, and she hugged me at the door, and I hugged her back, and I said I was glad she was home. We had dinner. We talked about her sister's recovery and whether the physiotherapy was helping. We talked about Thanksgiving, which was 3 weeks away, or which she'd told Joel was 3 weeks away. We cleaned up together and watched something on television that neither of us was actually watching, and then we went to bed. I lay there in the dark next to her and thought, 2 weeks. She didn't go to the basement that night, or the next day. She acted for 3 days completely normally. She cooked. She called Pam. She went to the grocery store. She asked me if the eave straw on the garage side needed looking at before winter. On the fourth day, she went to the basement. I was at the kitchen table when I heard the door. I checked the time. 2:14 in the afternoon. I didn't move. I made no sound. I sat at the table with my coffee and I waited. She was down there for about 20 minutes. I heard her come back up, close the door, go to the living room. I heard the television. That evening, I retrieved the recorder. I didn't listen to it right away. I put it in my jacket pocket and I drove to a parking lot behind the Hespeler Road Canadian Tire, the one I used to take the kids to get skate sharpening, and I sat there in the car and pressed play. Mostly what I heard was her moving things, the sound of the water softener, the hinge, the click of the light chain. Then silence. The quiet sounds of a person going through a private space with the certainty that they are completely alone. And then a phone call. Her voice low, in the way you speak when you're being careful. It's me. I'm home. Yeah, it went fine. He has no idea. The date is still the same. 3 weeks. I know. I need you to check the deposit cleared. A pause. No, I told you. I'll handle the car. I'll leave it at the airport, and he won't know which airport until it's already done. I know, Roberta. I know. I just need 3 more weeks. 3 more weeks. I sat in that parking lot until it was dark. Then I drove home and made dinner. I'm going to skip some of what came next because some of it involved lawyers and the investigator and my bank and my daughter, and not all of it is mine to tell. What I'll say is that I spent the next 10 days being very careful and very methodical. I had a meeting with the lawyer. I had a long conversation with Pam, who handled it with more composure than I expected and less than I feared. I had a conversation with my bank manager, a man I've dealt with for 15 years, who treated the situation with the kind of dignified seriousness that Canadians do well when they're genuinely trying to help you. I also, at the lawyer's suggestion, sent a formal notice to the financial institution where the Marlowe account was held. This was a legal step I won't detail, but it had the effect of placing a flag on certain transactions. And then I did one more thing. I called Joel. That was the hardest call. My son is not easily unsettled, but he was unsettled by this. He went very quiet in the way he's done since he was about 12 years old, when something doesn't fit inside any category he has for it. He asked a few questions. I answered them. He asked if I needed him to come to Guelph. I said not yet, that I needed a few more days. He said, Dad, why haven't you just confronted her? I said, because I'm not interested in a denial. I want her to know that I know everything, not just what I can prove. He said, and you're not there yet? I said, I will be in 4 days. 4 days later, Sylvia came downstairs in the morning to find me sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a folder. She said good morning. She poured herself coffee. She was wearing her blue robe, the one she's had for a decade, with the fraying cuff she always says she'll replace. She sat down across from me. I opened the folder. I slid the photographs across the table first. The room, the cot, the shelf, the passports, then the account statements, then a printout of the condominium transaction in Orlando, then the single page she had written in her own hand. She looked at the photographs. She didn't pick them up. She sat very still. I said, I found it when the plumber was here. She said nothing. I said, I've spoken to a lawyer. I've documented everything. The account in Susan Marlowe's name has been flagged. The Marlowe Family Trust listed in your new will has been noted. I have a recording of your phone call with Roberta from the basement, made in my own house, which my lawyer tells me is legal in Ontario. She still said nothing. I said, I'm not going to ask you why. I've thought about the why for a long time and I think I understand enough of it. What I want you to know is that there's no version of this where you disappear, and I'm left holding the confusion. That version is over, she looked at the table. Then she said quietly, "How long have you known?" I said, "Long enough." She asked about Roberta. I told her what I knew. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she looked, not devastated exactly, but caught. The way you look when the thing you prepared for so long arrives in a shape you didn't expect. She said, "I wasn't going to take everything." I said, "You were going to take yourself." That's not nothing after 34 years. She didn't have an answer for that. I closed the folder. I stood up. I said I would be at Joel's for the week and that the lawyer would be in touch about next steps. I had already packed a bag. It was at the top of the stairs. I walked past her to the hallway. I picked up the bag. I put on my coat. At the door, I turned around. She was still sitting at the table in her blue robe with the fraying cuff, her hands around her coffee mug, looking at the folder. I said, "I hope it was worth it." Then I left. I'm not going to tell you how everything resolved, because some of it is still resolving. The legal process in Ontario is not fast. The division of assets from a long marriage when one spouse has been diverting funds is not a simple thing. There are accountants and lawyers and documents, and it takes time. What I'll tell you is this. The condominium in Orlando was sold before it could become a more complicated problem. The Marlowe account was subject to a legal claim that my lawyer handled with considerably more efficiency than I expected. Roberta Finch has her own situation to navigate, which isn't mine to describe. Sylvia did not disappear. She is still in Guelph as far as I know in a rental on the east side. We don't speak, not directly. Everything goes through the lawyers now. Joel came to Guelph for Thanksgiving. He brought his wife and his daughter, and we had dinner at his place in Mississauga. Pam drove up from Hamilton. It was a good evening. We ate a lot and stayed late, and my granddaughter fell asleep on the couch with her boots still on, and I sat there and looked at my two kids talking in the kitchen and thought about what was real and what held. This held. I drive past my house sometimes, on the way to other places. The eavesdrow on the garage side did need attending. I can see the sag from the street. I'll deal with it in the spring. There's a plumber's invoice still on my kitchen table at Joel's. I keep meaning to file it. I don't know why I haven't. Maybe because it's the document that started everything, and I'm not quite ready to put it in a drawer. I don't need to understand all of it. I'm 63 years old, and I've lived long enough to know that some things don't resolve into a clean explanation. People build rooms inside their lives that their partners never see. That's a kind of loneliness I can't fix and couldn't have fixed. What I can tell you is that I walked out of my own front door on a Tuesday morning in October, with my bag packed and my head clear, knowing exactly what I knew and exactly what I was doing. That was enough. That was more than enough.